Thank you for joining today's Technology Transactions webinar. Our program today will focus on service level fundamentals in the digital age. My name is Brad Peterson, and I'm delighted to introduce today's program. I lead our global technology transactions practice, which has 50 lawyers around the globe specializing in data, digital, outsourcing, and software transactions. For us, the hottest growth areas have been the digital transformations made possible by automation, artificial intelligence, and robotics. However, we're seeing an uptake in interest in leveraging the power of outsourcing and customer-facing digital platforms to provide better, faster, more secure, and more reliable services. That, of course, brings service levels to center stage. I will cover a few administrative matters and then we'll get started. First, at the bottom of the screen, you will see that there are multiple application widgets that you can use. All of the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them about to get the most out of your desktop space. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking the arrows in the top right corner. For best viewing, we recommend using a wired internet connection, preferably with Chrome or Firefox browsers, and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background that could cause issues. Some networks cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are behind, pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues on the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. During today's presentation, you will be provided with an alphanumeric code for continuing legal education. If you are applying for CLE credit, you will need to record this code on the virtual sign-in sheet that you received by email with the connection details. You can also find a copy of the virtual sign-in sheet in the resource list widget entitled CLE Affirmation Form. Please note, we've also made the event evaluation form and the presentation deck available in the resource list widget for your convenience. This webinar is being recorded, as we normally do with these programs. In a day or so, we will be sending you an email with a link which you can use to listen to the webinar again or share it with your colleagues. The recording will also be posted on our website. We plan to allow time at the end of the program for questions. To submit a question electronically, please use the Q&A widget. If we don't get to your question during this webinar, we will make every attempt to follow up with you afterwards. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce my colleagues speaking on today's webinar, Chi Chen and Alan Velasco. Both Chi and Alan worked as engineers before law school, which helps today because service levels are at the intersection of contracting and engineering. Both Chi and Alan have had extensive experience in information technology and business process outsourcing transactions. Each of Chi and Alan are now a senior associate who's a go-to lawyer for leading companies, not just for outsourcing, but also for cloud, data, and digital transformation deals. Chi Chen is based in Chicago, and Alan Velasco is based in Palo Alto. So with those brief introductions, let's get started with today's program. Before Alan and Chi describe in detail how to create great service levels, let's spend a moment on the fundamentals. Service levels can create enforceable commitments to deliver the necessary quality, timeliness, accuracy, and completeness of services. Service levels can build trust between the supplier and the customer by aligning on what is adequate performance. Service levels can align incentives by creating a structure where, if there are service level problems, the problems are reflected on both sides. And we all know that incentives work in business, and as they say, what you get is what you pay for. Service levels also facilitate agility and innovation by motivating the supplier to find ways to deliver continuous, measurable improvements. However, To get the value that service levels can create, you must invest time and energy in negotiating and governing the service level provisions. Because you can only manage what you measure, and because incentives work, well-crafted service levels can drive great value, and poorly drafted ones can leak value. Today's presentation is designed to take you through 5 levels of investment and value in service levels. Level 1 is merely general commercial contracting terms, what we all learned in law school. Less investment, relatively little value, but the structure that's been around for millennia. At level 2, though, the parties have invested in defining a service level standard and expected performance. Level 2 is a critical step forward and creates the ability to have the conversation between the customer and supplier about performance. However, the conversation may be about numbers, but not agreed or trusted numbers. At level 3, the parties have invested in an agreed measurement methodology. It's documented, accurate, and auditable. So at level 3, the parties have a level of confidence in the numbers and an agreed service level methodology. At level 4, the parties align the supplier's incentives with the customer's needs by creating consequences for poor performance. For example, the supplier may have additional obligations, or its compensation might be reduced, or there may be a right of early termination for the customer. Imposing these incentives seeks to address the risk that the supplier will simply collect full fees while cutting corners and providing a disappointing level of service. Finally, at level 5, the customer seeks to prepare for the future, to future-proof, with steadily rising service levels and rights to adjust the service levels as its opportunities, its needs, and its priorities change. So with that, as an introduction, Chi, please start us off by telling us about the general contract terms at level 1.
Thank you, Brad. In a contracting world without the service levels, a customer already has the ability to rely on the provisions of the agreement and general contracting principles. So at the most basic level, your agreement should include clear, specific performance obligations, oftentimes found in a statement of work or services description document. The emphasis for these descriptions should be on clarity and a straightforward division of responsibility between the customer and supplier. Note, though, that no matter how good your description of services may be, they only state what the supplier must do, not how well the supplier is going to do it. In addition to the performance obligations, your agreement should also include performance warranties, examples such as the supplier providing services in a good and workmanlike manner, or in material compliance with the service descriptions. While performance warranties include the quality component that is missing from the performance obligations, using the warranties to ensure service quality will have its own complications. Under general contracting principle, the customer has a right to recover damages caused by supplier's breaches, including those described in the performance obligations and warranties. In addition, the agreement will likely have the right to terminate the services for cause due to material breach. However, these are extreme remedies that may be difficult to pursue. First, the amount of damages may be difficult to prove, especially when the harm is caused by substandard service quality as opposed to the supplier simply not doing the work. Most agreements will also have disclaimers for consequential or indirect damages, which tends to be the types of harm suffered for poor quality services. For example, where the customer's end users have to use a service that crashes frequently or is generally slow. While the customer can terminate for cause if the quality of the services are poor enough to constitute material breach, this tends to be a nuclear option, as the customer will have to bear the operational risk and cost of bringing in a new vendor on a short time schedule. Finally, as we all know, resolving these issues through litigation will be costly in both time and money, and the parties are unlikely to work together in the future. As a result, you can begin to see the gap in the general contractual terms with respect to ensure service quality. Next, Brad's going to explain how well-defined service level standard can help address this gap.
Um, um, since Brad's having some technical problems, thank you, Chi. Now let's talk about the second level where there is a service level standard. In order to have an effective service level standard, you need two things. First, you need a clear definition that results in a numeric value. Generally, that's a formula with a numerator and a denominator. For example, the numerator might be the number of incidents resolved within 4 hours during a month, and the denominator might be the total number of incidents during the month. So, for example, if there were 1,000 incidents and 990 were timely resolved, the actual service level was 99%. Second, you need a service level requirement. The service level requirement is the required level. So in our example, the actual performance was 99%. If the requirement was 98.5%, that's a success. If the requirement was 99.5%, that's a failure or a service level default. Unfortunately, it's not always that simple. Too often, though, the service levels will show as green when the stakeholders are feeling blue or even red. On the next slide, we'll walk through how this may happen and how the service levels have to work. Mismatches between service level definitions and the conditions in the customer environment can happen in several ways. First, the service level measures the wrong thing. Important services are red, and service levels measure green for the wrong and less important services. Reported performance of the services doesn't reflect actual performance of the services. The services are red, but due to definition carve-outs, exceptions, and exclusions in drafting, service levels are green. Third, incentives are not strong enough to change behavior. The service levels are red, and the services are red, but the supplier does not care sufficiently to fix because the credits or other incentives are too low and thus misaligned. And finally, the service levels remain stagnant while the world changes. The services are green and the service levels are green, but the levels were fine in the beginning of the contract but now are behind as compared to the rest of the industry and due to technology changes. So how do we avoid these problems? Let's discuss by going over the purpose behind service levels and using that to discuss a procedure for setting a service level standard on the next slide. Remember, the ultimate goal of service levels is not to win service level credits. Rather, the goal of service levels is to advance the customer's key business objectives or achieve the desired outcomes. This is how sourcing creates value, as Brad stated initially, by aligning the incentives of a supplier with those of the customer. We set a service level standard in 3 steps. The first step is not to decide you want 3 nines. Instead, the first step is to identify the desired outcomes that the customer wants to create, such as increased revenue or productive end users. The second step is to decide how and how much the supplier can help achieve those outcomes. Finally, you want to identify a way to measure how well the supplier is doing at those aspects of the service that matter to the customer's desired business outcomes. Aspects of this could include timeliness, quality, reliability, availability, or user satisfaction. Once you know what the customer wants, the challenge is in drafting the service level standard. On this next slide, a service level is only as good as its basic definition. The goal is effective communication of the intended outcome. This drafting is more mathematical, and you need to live in both the operational and contract drafting worlds. I typically find that drafting service level requires the attention to detail and scope similar to drafting statements of work, along with the mathematical, calculation-specific precision that is required by drafting a clear pricing methodology. To that end, like a formula, it is critical that you use consistent terms that are themselves clearly defined. Sometimes the formula is easy, but the underlying definitions like responded, incident, uptime, and critical can be challenging to identify for a specific customer organization. Given the importance of the definition and the possible complexity of the underlying terms, we recommend drafting the definitions like any other contract provision in Microsoft Word, rather than as notes in an Excel table. This promotes clear thinking and facilitates negotiations. Remember to draft to be clear to all audiences, including the technical people in offshore countries and the governance team at the customer. Now that we've gone over the goals in drafting service level definitions, Chi will set out an example for us to review.
Thank you, Alan. As Alan mentioned, drafting service level definition is not easy. It requires operational level assessment and careful legal drafting. Often the starting point is a single statement that one needs to unpack and drill down to remove ambiguities. For example, on this slide, the top bullet shows a common starting point provided by the business team. After some head scratching, we can guess that the business team here is looking for a response service level that measures the percentage of time supplier's response time is less than 15 minutes. To improve on this starting point, we will first need to understand what the business goal is. If, for example, the goal is for timely response when customer systems are having issues, we can clarify this by stating that the supplier is responding to how the percentage is calculated. In the second bullet here, you can see a revision. Instead of just saying response time, we indicate the number of incidents that supplier responds to customer in the applicable calendar month, and then divided by the number of incidents actually received by the supplier in the applicable month. This revised version uses the mathematical approach as a formula with numerator and a denominator, and the expected output as percentage and how it should be expressed. However, this revised version will still need further refinement. The meaning of the service level can vary widely by simply changing what the capitalized terms mean. In this example, incident can mean a request, a system report, or an escalated problem. And depending on the definition, that will change the outcome of the service level greatly. Similarly, what does the response mean? Is it simply the supplier sending an email, actually placing a telephone call, or is it automatic system response? And finally, the service level definition should clearly state when a service level applies and when all exceptions may apply. So for the purposes here, the time from when a supplier has escalated the incident to a third-party hardware vendor in accordance with the process and procedures manual to the time when supplier receives a response will be excluded from this calculation. Crafting clear and unambiguous service level definitions take practice. And on this next slide, we'll list some common pitfalls in this drafting. So on this slide, we're listing 8 of the common pitfalls in drafting service level definitions. And we'll go through them one by one. First, using metrics designed for internal operation for an external service provider. Second, assuming that metrics from one deal will work for another. Third, ignoring what happens to misses. On this number 3, if the service level is 90% resolution time in 4 hours, how long will it take to resolve the remaining 10%? A supplier might be tempted to ignore an issue that has already missed the deadline in favor of making sure new issues are resolved to meet the service level. In that case, those 10% becomes your angry user. As another example, 99% availability for 1,000 servers can still mean that 10 servers are off all month. Number 4, ambiguity on where measurements start and stop. On number 4, response time measurements can vary widely depending on whether you start the measurement when an incoming call is logged by the system versus when the representative picks up the call. Number 5, broad exceptions and exclusions. You always want to make sure to avoid broad language such as any act or omission by customer or third party, failure of equipment software systems, or causes not contemplated by supplier. These are likely to make the service level toothless as the supplier will use them as excuses for missing service levels. Number 6, deferring issues for later dispute with words such as reasonable, appropriate, or significant. Number 7, measuring multiple suppliers performing similar services with inconsistent definitions. This will lead to difficulties in supplier management. Finally, stating that service levels are the only obligation of the supplier or the sole indicator of value to customer. Service levels cannot reflect each and every contractual commitment made by the supplier. By stating or implying that they're the only obligation of the supplier or sole indicator of value to the customer, it implies that service levels are a measure of damages, which is not their purpose. The purpose of service levels is to help align the service supplier's incentives with those of the customer. On the next slide, Alan is going to explain how to create good service level requirements go along with these definitions.
Thanks, Jay. Once you have a good service level definition, you need to identify what requirements you have for supplier performance. Customers typically designate a minimum level as a safety net, below which the customer would actually be harmed or lose business value, as well as an expected level, which should be achievable by supplier more often than not. Our example here shows the common approach by customers of using a minimum expected service level. As you can see, while a single miss of the minimum service level would be counted as a service level breach, the supplier will have to miss the expected service level multiple times before they commit a service level breach. The real difficulty in setting the service level requirement is how to determine the appropriate service level requirements. This may come from the supplier in its RFP response or from the customer where the supplier has agreed only to take over an existing customer operation and run it as well as the customer ran it. Supplier may try to further reduce its responsibilities by claiming that the customer has incomplete or untrustworthy data, and therefore the supplier will not commit to a requirement until it has made its own measurements during a transition period. We recommend avoiding this situation where the supplier is baselining its own performance, as it's equivalent to asking someone to run around the track with the stipulation that they'll need to keep up that pace for another 100 laps. The supplier is obviously incentivized to sandbag its performance during this baseline period. Instead, consider identifying stated values, then letting supplier ramp up to those levels during a transition period as a compromise. For example, if the final minimum is 97%, ramp up would start at 93% and transition up monthly. With this, Brad will introduce the concept of the measurement methodology in Level 3.
Thank you, Alan. At Level 2, the parties have service levels defined. However, too often we see our customer-side clients agree on service levels without having decided how they will be measured. And this leads to distrust and disputes later in the deals because the way the results are measured, the sensitivity to failures, determines the actual performance measured for the service level. Worst case, a service level may turn out not to be measurable at all. So at Level 3, your goal is to design a measurement methodology that stands the test of time by being workable, auditable, and accurate. G, please describe for us how to do that.
Thanks, Brad. So as Brad just mentioned, we're looking to describe a measurement methodology that is verifiable, accurate, and auditable. It is also important to use measurement methodologies that are relatively easy to administer in order to minimize the customer's expense in managing its supplier base. We have listed some of the common measurement methodologies on this slide. The measurement may come from customers' end users or logged by suppliers' employees as a part of their service. For certain service levels, that will be impossible to measure each data point. An example here will be call quality in a call center service. Taking a sample instead may be more appropriate. Finally, as services are incorporating more digital and AI advances, customers are increasingly moving towards automated monitoring. The ideal measurement methodology should align the service levels to desired business outcomes, and it should be rigidly defined so that there is as little room as possible for the supplier to interpret the underlying data for its own benefit. As we will discuss in more depth later, the measurement methodology should ensure that the service levels are monitored and reported on a consistent basis. And finally, it's important to consider who will be monitoring and reporting on the data. While the most common approach is for the supplier to take on this role, it may be good to have an independent third party to monitor instead, so that there is an unbiased reporter. And automated monitoring is increasingly becoming an option and will allow for an unbiased reporter without having to hire another contractor. On this slide, we show an illustration of how the choice of measurement methodology alone can significantly impact the results of the service levels. Let's imagine that the service standard here is the number of failures that occur in devices supported by the supplier. In the first measurement methodology, we measure the number of failures based on what is reported by end users. End users may report only 25 failures in a month because they don't always report minor errors. or they might lack the understanding of what a failure really is. In the second methodology, indicated by the yellow circle, the number of failures is logged by supplier's employees as a part of their job. This will likely result in a more exact count, as the logging will be built into the service process. However, there will still be certain failures missed due to human error or issues in the process. Finally, the circle representing green is a measurement methodology that uses automated monitoring system. This is likely to be the most accurate way of measurement. It is not subject to human error and does not require human judgment. If a tree falls in the woods but no end reporters report it, tree fall. And speaking of automated monitoring, Brad and Alan will present a more detailed discussion on the use of automated processes for service levels on the next slide.
So automated monitoring is where the new advances in automation, machine learning, and AI are starting to impact the value of service levels. At this point, automation is most likely to be useful in large-scale organizations where companies can provide more data to the automated monitoring tool. Under ITIL version 4, optimization and automation are among the guiding principles. Alan?
Thanks, Brad. Automated monitoring reduces the risk that service level monitoring will be skipped or forgotten and ensures that service levels will be correctly reported on. Once the service level standard is programmed into the system, it can remove the ability to hide on reporting of service level issues, the various scenarios Chi just mentioned on the previous slides. Additionally, automated monitoring can save time by reducing commonly repeated work, for example, for reporting, extracting raw data, writing queries, or by automating escalations. More advanced automated monitoring can analyze complex scenarios, for example, by synthesizing multiple data sources, and maybe even used to aid higher level service delivery decisions and close out service level management issues. A big trend in the industry recently is to resolve, either by implementing a workaround or the ultimate service level resolution automatically without any human intervention. On this next slide, automated monitoring, if correctly defined and implemented, shows great potential and opportunities. Such automated monitoring can reduce the cost of gathering service level data and governing the contract. Finally, automated monitoring allows for real-time monitoring that can predict that certain levels are at risk instead of waiting for the end of a measurement period window to know the outcome of whether there was a service level default. Such predictive monitoring also allows the supplier to take corrective action and prevent the service level default in the first place. While automated monitoring may be helpful to businesses, automation also creates risks, namely, incorrectly coded monitoring tools could take longer to discover, since automation obscures inputs and calculations in the name of simplicity, and could lead to incorrect feedback for governing the services down the road. Additionally, automated monitoring tools may not be compatible with all legacy systems in a customer environment. Moreover, a debate over a predictive model could lead to disagreements on what the appropriate response should be to at-risk service levels. A supplier may want one action and the customer another. Finally, let's turn back to our example incident response time service level that Chi illustrated. When the system is programmed to respond automatically, does the response time service level still represent a useful measure to you as a customer? Remember this for when we get to level 5. Now that we have walked through the high-level issues on measurement methodologies and automated monitoring, let's walk through an example on setting the measurement methodology. Chi?
There are a lot of ways to memorialize measurement methodology, and on this slide we show a common example of how this can happen. Using the same incident response time service level that we developed earlier. Beyond the contractual language of the definition, the measurement methodology requires a technical translation so that there is agreement on the specifics. You will see here that we have identified a data source, which is ServiceNow. Then we have the detailed file name and the location on where to find it by reporting purposes and for the purposes of any audits. Next, we have a summary of what data elements need to be in that file. such as incident count, actual duration, and average duration. Finally, we also describe the supporting data that is linked to this particular service level. So in this case, we might have things like incident ID, reported severity, incident start date and time, and service response date and time. To get a clear idea of what you need to measure, you must look to your subject matter experts to make sure that you can execute on what you're working on to build and get agreement on the details. It should be directly linked to and influence the service level you're trying to measure. Often, a conversation among SMEs before any misses will result in a useful methodology right off. Alan?
Here on this slide, we have an example of the current service level dashboard offered by a common ITSM tool, ServiceNow. To be timely and useful, the service levels here should have the data sources identified and the measurements that need to be automated. And you can see here on this illustration here, there's a categorization offered for active service levels to see whether, first, there are SLAs at risk of being breached, and second, if there are SLAs that have been breached. The at-risk service levels are an example of the implemented predictive modeling currently seen in the industry today. By understanding the underlying methodology of the service levels, this will lead to agreement that the predictive model is correct and when it states that the service level is at risk. Now that we have walked through examples of level 3 in the measurement methodologies, I'll turn it over to Brad and Chi to introduce us on what we do with these measurements.
Thank you, Alan. If you're a customer and you've invested enough to get to level 3, you want to know that all that good work is going to drive performance and value. And realistically, the damage from a failure to meet a service level will be difficult to quantify, and it'll be too small to efficiently pursue in court. It's just not worth pursuing. So you want to set incentives that work easily in the context of outsourcing governance or governing a customer-facing digital platform agreement, and you want to set the right incentives. Chi, please take us through a few ideas of how to do that.
Thanks, Brad. So service level credits are typically what we think of when we think of incentives for supplier to provide high quality services. But there are actually quite a few other contractual obligations related to service levels that also help to align suppliers' incentives with those of the customer. In addition to service level credits, an obligation to report on service level performance on a regular basis, an obligation to identify and correct root causes for any failures, and a bright line right to terminate the contract for cause based on service level failures can all help incentivize suppliers to meet the service level standards. On this next slide, we'll talk about how the obligation to report can act as an incentive for suppliers. So simply getting a monthly report like the one that's shown on the slide can provide much needed transparency, customer awareness, and to spur governance discussions between the customer and supplier. And the very act of creating this report requires a supplier to reflect on any service shortfalls at a regular interval. In addition, if there are regular governance meetings where service level performance is presented, the supplier will also be thinking about how these discussions are going to go. It's human nature to avoid reporting service levels that are in the red, like the ones shown here, and suppliers are further incentivized to avoid this when they know they will have to discuss the failures with customers during regular meetings. Just as a quick note, while the summary report here simply shows the aggregated results and the red, yellow, green indicators, customers should also request the backup data to go along with these reports to verify these results. Again, auditability and verifiability is a very important part of a successful service level paradigm. So next, we'll move on to obligations to correct failures. So similar to the obligations to report on its performance, an obligation to investigate and correct root cause for any failures incentivizes the supplier to be proactive in addressing service level failures before they even occur. This slide shows some common obligations that some common bundle of obligations that are related to this. So for example, in the first bullet, we say the supplier must promptly investigate the underlying causes of the failure. And then they must provide an analysis of the root cause as soon as practicable, in any event within a certain amount of time. They must also correct the root cause as soon as practicable if supplier is the responsible party. If they're not, they need to coordinate the correction of the root cause with the third-party suppliers. They must also advise the customer of the status of remedial efforts being undertaken with respect to the root cause, demonstrate to customer reasonable satisfaction that the root cause has been permanently corrected, and then take commercially reasonable actions to prevent any reoccurrence. With that, Alan's going to walk us through the service level credit methodology in detail.
Thanks, Xi. The third incentive, service level credits, is where most of the negotiation occurs. Here we have an example. So first we have an at-risk amount, which equals a certain percentage of the month's charges, and each service level has a percentage that we call the allocation. If the supplier fails to meet a service level in a month, then the supplier shall grant a credit equal to its allocation multiplied by the at-risk amount. So for example, with an at-risk amount of 15% and monthly charges of $1 million, we have an at-risk amount of $150,000 per month. If the allocation percentage is equal to 40%, then the credit is equal to $150,000 times 40%, or $60,000. The total of all service level credits in any month cannot exceed the at-risk amount, and the credits do not limit other remedies. Remember, service levels are not a penalty, and so customer is not in the business of charging service level credits. Service levels are an incentive to get the supplier to act in accordance with contracts. In the next slide, let's build further on the timely incident resolution example response example that we had before. Let's take a customer environment where there are different grades of incidents. So in the example matrix shown on the slide, we have, again, an at-risk amount of 15% with monthly charges at risk of $1 million. The first new concept here that we have here is a pool percentage for allocation. The concept here is that having a number of percentage points to assign to each of the service levels, so that way a supplier does not need to miss all service levels to face the at-risk amount. In this example, we have a pool percentage of 250% for allocation. The supplier will only pay 100% of the at-risk amount, but it may only miss 4 out of 10 service levels in a month, for example. You can emphasize the importance of different service levels by assigning different allocations between the service levels. Finally, in the example above, the timely incident resolution is varied with different service level requirements. For example, with respect to Severity 1 incidents, where Severity 1 incidents are the most important, the expected and minimum standards are higher along with a higher allocation. The variance in service level requirements allows a customer to emphasize higher severity incidents over lower ones. You can see the varying expected and minimum service level requirements for Severity 2 and Severity 3 incidents. Now I'll turn it over to Chi to walk us through the final service level incentive.
Yes, thanks, Alan. So far in this level 4, we've mostly been talking about incentives where the customer is wielding the stick. So on this slide, we would like to talk about some positive incentives as well. First, we have the Earnback. This is a concept where the supplier has a chance to earn back service level credits incurred through service level failures. Note that this aligns with the concept that the goal of service levels is not for customer to receive money, but as an incentive for supplier to permanently correct root causes and to ensure service quality. Second, we have the concept of service level bonus. This is kind of the mirror image of service level credits. Supplier can earn additional fees for overperformance. While this seems like an obvious idea, this concept is not very commonly used because it is not appropriate for most services. The reason is that customers typically buy what they need, and paying for overperformance is just not a good return for your money. In some cases, though, this is appropriate. An example might be a contract where the customer is providing services that directly contribute to revenue. In those cases, the bonuses provide an incentive for supplier to overperform, and both parties will share in the windfall. So with that, we'll return to the final incentive for service levels. Adding contract language that sets a bright line standard for service level failures, leading to customers' right to terminate for cause, can be a powerful incentive. Instead of just paying service level credits, the supplier is now at risk of losing its future revenue stream. And absent a bright line, service level defaults will still serve as evidence of material breach that could provide the customer with the right to terminate for cause. However, the supplier will preserve all arguments that even multiple or repeated defaults were not sufficiently material, and to claim that customer's termination was improper or not permitted. The bright line establishes pre-agreement by the parties about how much failure is too much. We've included here some contract language examples. For example, customer may have a bright line right to terminate if the supplier pays a certain amount of credits consistently or fails service levels regularly, both indicators of continued bad quality of service. The final example on this slide captures the idea that certain service levels may be so material that a single failure would provide customer with the option to walk. For example, a no check behind policy in a payroll deal, where failing to pay an employee in any month cannot be permitted. So with that, I'll leave this to Brad to start discussing level 5, future proofing.
Thank you, Chi. If you've invested in a level 4 service agreement, you've got a really solid starting point for your outsourcing or other digital relationship. But this is a very fast-changing world, and the relationships where service levels are used, outsourcing, digital platforms, and so forth, are almost inherently long-term arrangements in a fast-changing world. At level 5, the goal is to future-proof those service levels so that they continue to provide value throughout the life of the contract. Alan, please tell us how that can be accomplished.
Certainly, Brad. The first step to future-proofing is to require continuous improvement of the service levels to reflect both a percentage of any overperformance over the prior year, along with automatic increases by a percentage or a market standard. Let's revisit the example of our timely incident response service level for severity 2 incidents. There we had an expected service level of 97%. But what if the supplier consistently achieves 98%? We want the service level requirement to reflect that overperformance. Maybe the correct standard should increase then by 10 or 15% of the overperformance on a year-over-year basis. So in this example, it would increase to 97.1% or 97.15%. Beware of the pitfall of continuous improvement. Automatic discussion instead of automatic increase. Automatic discussion means that often there is no increase or an increase automatically, or you might face an increased price for such increased performance. Second, create rights to adjust service levels to anticipate future needs. Common reallocations are the right to reallocate percentages between service levels, the right to move critical performance indicators, those with credits, to key performance indicators, those without credits, and key performance indicators to critical performance indicators, and the right to add or modify service levels under a defined process for determining service level requirement. Especially useful is if the reallocation rights for service levels are not subject to mutual agreement, but can be done through notice to the supplier. This allows you, the customer, to adapt the service levels to your particular contractual situation. For example, let's say that the supplier is having trouble responding to incidents in a timely manner. To emphasize the importance of the response, you might decide to increase the allocation for severity 2 incidents from 30% to 50% to emphasize the importance with the supplier. If the lower severity level timely response service levels were a key measurement or a KPI without service level credits, you might decide instead to promote it to a critical service level. On this next slide, we have another example of future proofing, which is having both pre and post transformation service levels. Many of you will be affecting a transformation as part of your contractual requirements. Better service is what you're buying with a transformation, so the service levels should reflect the desired end state to account for the investments made by a customer during the term. Important behind this concept is to contract for an automatic step change in the service levels, for example, upon completion of the transformation, rather than require agreement again to change the service levels. Finally, the ultimate goal in the industry today is to set outcome-based service levels. To set the service levels not based on just the technical requirements, but on the customer outcomes that are desired. We've talked a lot during this presentation about service levels that measure outputs from the supplier's services, such as incident response time, which have been traditionally measured because the technical requirements are well understood. But let's take an example where there was a transformation, and now the service levels are automatically responded to by a computer system. Does measuring the timely incident response service level still represent a measure of value to the customer? Probably not, where the system will automatically respond with an email to the user. What instead we should consider is measuring what the supplier outputs were a proxy to measure. In the case of timely incident response, the major concern centers on the ability of a customer to access the systems required for its users to do their jobs. Ultimately, the supplier outcomes mentioned are a proxy for a customer outcome. Was there a revenue loss due to the services? You can see the problem here. How do we track back to the amount of revenue loss that the supplier caused, especially where there might be many factors feeding into that revenue loss? These are hard questions and subject to further discussions, but we want to highlight this as the area where the industry is heading. Indeed, ITIL version 4 emphasized the principle of focusing value and thinking holistically about the business and not just an IT organization. Now that we have walked through each of the 5 levels, I'll turn it over to Brad to do a final walkthrough of our service level value curve.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Chi. The takeaway from this presentation is not the individual pieces and individual ideas on how to improve service levels. The principal takeaway is that there's a trade-off between value and investment. And while service levels can deliver great performance over an extended period, they do take an investment, and that with more investment you can get more value. With very little investment, you can copy from any forms book for any commercial contract for the last 30 years the general contract terms that originated decades, if not millennia before. But with some additional work, you can define what are we actually trying to buy and come up with a defined service level standard so the parties have a way to discuss what good performance looks like. That will get you only so far, though, because anyone who's worked in that environment knows that you then find yourself in difficult governance discussions about what do those level 2 service levels really mean in terms of actual performance. And you can only get there by thinking through in advance some sort of an accurate, auditable service level and an effective way to measure it. And that creates trust, and that creates business value. In addition, parties who have an effective and meaningful service levels can move to level 4 and actually drive performance by setting incentives for those service level standards. And as she described, it can be as easy as sitting down with people and saying, here's the promise from level 2, here's the performance from level 3, let's have a conversation about why there's a gap. And then finally, the world is changing ever faster, as we are seeing, and it's becoming a time to expect unexpected events. It's becoming a time to expect that everything will be getting better and all of your digital competitors will be driving forward. And as a result, building in future-proofing is a way to preserve value. And service levels are not just a way for customers to claim value from suppliers. Service levels are a way for suppliers to promise superior value to customers. Suppliers who come forward in the market, and we've seen this in many places, with a well-defined service level that customers believe will be accurately and auditably measured, with appropriate incentives for actual performance and adaptation to the future, are prevailing in the market. So we believe that you can get tremendous value in your service level, in your outsourcing agreements, and your customer-facing platforms by leveraging this technology. What we'd like to do now, and just in a summary, the value increases steadily. There are ways to build for the future. It's not easy, but it's well worth the investment. But it looks like at this point we've got about 8 minutes for the Q&A portion of the program. And for those of you who have questions, please submit those questions electronically via the Q&A widget. And as a reminder, if we don't get to your question during the program, we will make every attempt to follow up with you after the program. And with that let's turn to questions. The first question that it's hard to tell actually what the first questions are. I think the first question that came in. Go on.
Yeah, it's about the service levels having to do with cloud services. So the question in its entirety is that we stated the purpose of service levels is to incentivize performance, but for cloud services, a one-to-many model, is this still true? The supplier often provides services equally to all its customers despite any customer service levels. How can one customer influence service delivery? And this is an issue that we've seen a lot with cloud service deliveries. As the questioner states, cloud services are a one-to-many service, and they typically refuse to provide customized service levels based for each of its customers. In this case, we find that in most cases, unless you are one of its largest clients, they are not going to budge on that position. And this becomes a business level consideration between having customized service levels versus often much lower service fees. As with a lot of other considerations of cloud going to using cloud services, these are trade-offs that the business team must consider before choosing the right vendor.
And Chi, I'd just like to add that you can also rely on the traditional contracting remedies that you mentioned in levels 1 and 2, or level 1, right, where you have the reps and warranties given, and you probably have some kind of termination right to get out of a cloud agreement as well.
Yes.
The second question I see, it came in from a couple of people. A lot of suppliers will limit the remedy due for an SLA breach to either a credit or a termination right. How do you get the suppliers to agree that the customer may seek other remedies? Another view of this is many vendors will argue that service credit should be an exclusive remedy, and what's your view on that? On the most critical piece of that, there is a difference between what you can measure and what matters. Service levels are about what you can measure, which may not be what matters. And in fact, in the deals we work on, rarely is all of what matters. So a service level breach cannot truly be an exclusive remedy. And in fact, if a service level credit or a termination right for a service level breach is an exclusive remedy, it may cut off the most important incentives that have been built into our legal system, the right to have damages. So for example, poor performance, if there's some sort of a catastrophe, if there's a catastrophic failure to deliver, that will also breach service levels. Service levels are not a shield against liability. Service levels are an incentive. Now, with the question of how do we get providers to agree, providers would prefer a liability shield, of course, not an incentive. The power of competition, courage of your convictions, executive support, and the usual techniques for making sure that you develop a high-value agreement. Chi or Alan, any thoughts to add to that?
Yes, Brad. We also find in the past that sometimes there's a compromise that can be reached in saying that the act of breaching service levels themselves may provide only the exclusive remedy of the service level credit or the termination right. However, we clarify that the underlying causes that might have caused the service level breach itself are not limited by this exclusion, so that you can still claim other remedies for suppliers' actions outside of the consequence of failing the service level.
G, do you have a good example of that in illustration?
Yeah, the typical language that we would use will be, notwithstanding an exclusive remedy, supplier acknowledges that any cause of the service level breach, or this an exclusive remedy will not bar the customer from seeking any other remedies allowed under the agreement or contract law for the underlying causes that cause the service level breach.
Right. So, for example, if there was a service level around the number of security incidents, for example, right, and there was that restriction, right, and they still violated, and there was a service level breach with respect to that, because there were too many service level security incidents, that still shouldn't bar a claim for gross negligence, for example, because a supplier forgot to turn on a firewall with respect to a certain system. Brad, I think we have time for one more question.
Listen, let's take the question. Question came in. Do you recommend root cause analysis for all SLAs or only for a certain critical subset of SLAs? G, would you like to start on this one?
Sure. As a general rule, we actually ask for root cause analysis for all failures, not even limited to just service level failures. The root cause analysis should be a process built into the service delivery process, such that any time supplier fails to meet one of its obligations, it has to conduct that root cause analysis and provide the customer with with a plan to fix the issues.
Anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, it'd be great to do root cause analysis for all of them. Obviously, there is some law of diminishing returns, right? You don't want to be chasing severity level 4 incidents with root cause analysis, probably. And so it's more of a business judgment than a legal judgment as to require it. And we've seen any variety, which is priority 1 and priority 2 incidents, maybe, or even just priority 1 incidents. It's a business level judgment that your teams need to make given your environment and your systems.
With that, I think we're out of time. That wraps up today's program, and on behalf of Mayor Brown and Chi and Ellen, thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today. We very much hope that you found this program useful. Some final housekeeping items for all of you as participants. First, a recording and a link to the materials from this program will be distributed by email to you in the next day or two. Second, if you're applying for CLE credit, the certificates of attendance will be distributed not within a day or two, but within 30 days of the program date. And third, please watch your inbox for invitations to our future programs in this Technology Transactions webinar series. To submit topic ideas or receive invitations to future programs, please email us at techtransactions@mayorbrown.com. Thank you for participating. This concludes our webinar.